Velkommen. I hope it's fine to follow this in English for everyone. And if I don't remember an English word, I may switch to Norwegian because you actually know words I don't know. Okay. So I'm really excited to have you all here. And I'm thinking Afrofuturism. Some people know it if they have listened to Sun Ra, who was born on the planet Saturn in 1914, according to himself. Maybe you have listened to Janelle Monáe, Beyoncé has some Afrofuturistic things. It's debatable, everything here. Maybe you have read or seen Black Panther or other things. We have a reading group. Tøyen lesesirkel has read Kindred, Skyldfolk by Octavia Butler. So I'm really happy to have you here. But I think also for many people this is a foreign word, Afrofuturism. What's that? That's what people have said to me the last weeks. And it's quite new for me as well, actually. So I'm really excited to have an event on it to understand more. So we have Duduzile Mathonsi, performance artist and writer, and much more from South Africa, but based in Norway, Trondheim. Thomas Talawa Prestø, choreographer, academic, and a lot more, of Tabanka Dance Ensemble, who recently got Bergesen-prisen. Congratulations with that.
Thank you.
We will have dance and drums afterwards. That's why you are all sitting over there. And Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, was it correct?
Yeah.
So sort of. From the university in Oslo, associate professor there. So, Afrofuturism. We will discuss it a little bit, and then we will have a performance lecture from Duduzile. So we will maybe enter a little bit of what it is. If you were to give like a very short definition, Duduzile, what would that be?
Afrofuturism, I guess it's also such a complex one. But it's the future of Afronism. What is going on with my English? It's talking to you in vernac English, but it's basically the future of Afro. And looking into our archives, our future, but also creating space for us to exist in it, whether it's artistic, whether it's in everyday life, but it is the future we want to see. So.
Yeah, so the Africanism, the Afro, we'll dig deeper into that. Well, what about you, Thomas? What do you think? If you have to be short?
Afrofuturism and, well, links to other futurisms, but is a way to also reclaim the contemporary, because the hegemony of colonialism and Eurocentricity has very often taken modernism and contemporaneity away from the African diasporan. So Afrofuturism is in a way to reclaim that and then imagine forward from there.
Okay. There will be possible to ask question afterwards. If there's some things you don't understand or think is difficult, maybe I should translate something. But please don't feel too stupid. Just ask about anything. You said link to other futurisms, and maybe that's where you come in as well, because you are actually a computer scientist who then jumped to literature. What were you thinking? But still, you got a job, and you actually. There's something very exciting going on at the university in Oslo now, due to futurism. Can you tell us a little bit about your two research projects and how Afrofuturism comes into this?
Sure. I mean, I would love to. I mean, I started out in computers, but I have been doing literature for a very long time. So I've moved back and forth. Let me just put it that way.
You made the website for the literary project.
Yeah. So I'm currently leading two large projects on. It's called Co-Futures. The overall idea is called Co-Futures, and it's a way of looking at many different kinds of futurisms these have older histories, but many of them are pretty much things that have more or less coalesced as formations, as aesthetic formations, as literary formations, as genre formations in the last couple of decades. So there's Afrofuturism, there's indigenous futurisms, there's Arab futurism, there's Gulf futurism, there's Indo-futurism, there's Desi futurism, there's rice punk. There's a lot of different kinds of things. So my project kind of tries to look at all these different futurisms very specifically in the last couple of decades, and not so much find a point of comparison, but to find points of dialogue between these different futurisms. And I think Afrofuturism kind of, the way it fits into all of this is that it's also what so many of these other futurisms have drawn their inspiration from. So if we go into the history of these futurisms, then a lot of what happened with Afrofuturism and with experimentations. I mean, you mentioned Sunra. I mean, there's a whole contested domain of creativity there, but pretty much from the early 2000s onwards, they take inspiration from Afrofuturism, and then you have this kind of like a dynamism and this explosion of futurisms. So it's an identity.
But when you talk about futurisms from many places in the world, but can you just give us a short definition of futurism so we can understand?
I think it serves 2-3 different kinds of purposes, because by itself it doesn't mean anything. Sure, it's about the future, but one is it's very specifically about a certain kind of future for a certain kind of people, whether it's an ethnic entity or whether it's a nation state or howsoever we want to think of it. So the first part of it is that it's a descriptor which talks about the future related to that specific entity, aesthetic, ethnic, whatever we want to call it. The second is it's used as a marketing label, and that's also very important to understand because it's also a commercial thing. So a lot of the labeling that goes on in different fields, like, oh, this is an Afrofuturistic. Like this whole discussion that has been kind of like last couple of years, Afro versus African futurism, Okorafor kind of like sparked it off.
We'll talk about that afterwards, yeah.
But it's again a question, like, where does this come from? Who has a claim to what identity, right? And that also is a marketing label problem.
Okay.
But finally, I think the way I want to understand it, and this is perhaps my own biases creeping into it somewhat, it's a way to reformulate the problem of time. And for the longest time, time has itself been colonized. So the notion of what the future is, that is basically under threat.
Okay.
And I think that these futurisms are opening up that future. It's the challenge to that threat of a closure. And that's the closure that colonialism affected. So it's a political futurism as well.
Okay.
So,
yeah. Okay. Do you have comments on what he said? Or should we move forward?
I can open up or add to, more than it's a specific comment to.
Okay.
But he touched on it in some ways, saying that both time has been colonized, meaning also on the understanding of time has been colonized, and was similar to what I mentioned when I said that modernity and contemporaneity is taken away from the other, meaning all black and brown people of the world, and is given to a Eurocentrism.
Yeah, because
and that's essential in the futurism.
So then you mean like the Western way of seeing time has been like the neutral, correct way, like
White
the
European.
past in the past?
Yeah. I would even say white
And
European,
the futurism
because often
future.
we say Western.
Yeah,
And
okay.
the Caribbean is Western, the African American is Western. We are
so
all
we're
Western.
already into it, yeah.
Yeah, so, but yes, so
Yeah,
that is
okay.
part of it. So, for example, both Afrofuturism and African futurism usually use something which can be described as ancient future. So you look back to move forward.
Yeah, because that
While-
sounds so paradoxical from, like, my point of view.
Yes, and when
ancient
I think the
future.
Italian who coined futurism, in a sense, it meant a break. You break away from the art that is already, and you kind of celebrate an innovation that
Okay.
is completely new. African futurism does not do that. It embraces the past to move forward.
A silly question then, is that why we see in books and films spirits from what I would say the past, like the ancestors, how the ancestors are with you now also? Is that like
in a
one
sense,
of the
because in
things?
most of our cultures, the ancestors are not dead.
Yeah. Oh,
And,
yeah, right.
Dudu can be a reincarnation of her grandmother, and her daughter could also be a reincarnation of her grandmother. So you could even
Right.
sometimes have 3 living examples of the same incarnation. So time to us is not chronological in the same way, which also changes art. Because if you do Western art theory, you learn that because death is kind of the final wall, that affects a lot of how
Yeah.
art is produced.
Right.
When that idea is colonized, that's why you can say in the West, dance is ephemeral, which means försvinner,
Forgjengelig.
forgjengelig. It's only of the moment.
Yeah.
The way I'm taught to dance is permanent. I am of the moment.
Okay.
It's quite a big difference.
Yeah. And I guess this thing with time, that it can be in a different way than we learn growing up in Norway, that's also what makes sci-fi and fantasy relevant to futurism, right? Yeah.
But I also feel that sci-fi does risk taking away the importance and the agency of African and Afrofuturism, because when we look at history, we look at the structures that have removed our history and turned our history into mythology. So the risk of using this kind of separation is that we risk going back to that same cycle of not having our history tangible. Again, then it becomes a myth, or it becomes stories that we're told, where in actual fact, in
Yeah.
Africanism, it's a practice.
Yeah,
And
because
it's right now.
Because when we had a preparation talk, I talked to you about the mythologies of your ancestors, and then we had to talk 20 minutes.
Yeah.
How about that
Yeah.
was wrong to say?
Yes, because then it's taking away my archive, taking away my agency, and taking away who I am by removing the tangibility of who I am and the connection that I am as an African. And again, trying to rewrite it in putting it in sci-fi. Because sci-fi, then it becomes non-human again. And this is a whole nother conversation. So I think we can work with sci-fi, but Afrofuturism has moved so much into this box of sci-fi that it's kind of taking away our humanity all over again.
Or the Afrofuturism that crosses over,
Yes.
I would even more specifically say.
What do you mean by that?
That crosses over from the African to, for example, the European. So the African futurism that the European can touch.
Okay.
The African futurism that is at the border very often touches sci-fi, because then people say, oh, there were spaceships. This must be futurism.
Okay, I see.
Because it's
Yeah.
recognizable.
Yeah.
And that's what very often happens. Bob Marley is an example. Bob Marley is the reggae that crossed over.
Right. Yeah.
And he was so much the reggae that crossed over that half of his band left because they felt he had lost the core.
Okay.
It's,
So
yeah.
just to have it said, it took me quite a while to dig into what Afrofuturism is, and I'm still wondering. So if this feels a little bit difficult, hang on, we're coming into it. And I've put up some books here. It's some of the Afrofuturist books we have in Diechmans.no. Unfortunately, it's a lot we don't have. But what also is important here is practice. And maybe, Duduzile, you would like to take your performance lecture now. I haven't read your text. But I will just say that some topics or themes in Afrofuturism is feminism and it's reclamation, like to reclaim what is lost, like, and I know I'm narrowing it down now, but like slaves were taken from the African continent and to other countries, and then they lost something, and we try to reclaim it through Afrofuturism. It's one of the strategies, and it's water, and it's earth. Yeah.
Wind, fire,
So I'm just mentioning it now also because you are you are doing a performance lecture for us on representation.
which is part of
Yeah.
the futurism.
Yes, representation.
And then I'm just going to be difficult. No,
Yeah,
okay.
please.
No, not difficult, but just to remember, because that would be Afrofuturism in the diaspora.
Yeah.
Duduzile is continental.
Yes.
So she did not lose it on the transatlantic.
Absolutely.
In the same way.
I
So
plan
what-
to talk about that afterwards, but we can, because
Yeah.
I think it's a lot now, but we can. So what is Afrofuturism is made outside Africa, outside the African continent, but African futurism, like you grew up in South Africa, so
It's within the continent.
yeah, that's on. So, but you live in Norway, so we can talk about that afterwards. What that do to stuff, but. Please, let's just see your performance lecture. Welcome, Duduzile. Mathonsi.
Hello? So when you look at me, take a hard look, it's okay. Do I represent you? When you look at me, do I represent you? Does my body, does my hair, my mannerisms, do I represent you? My name is Duduzile Libazisa Sfiso Mathonsi, the comforter, the one that consoles the wish. Hello, my ancestors are calling.
If you stay over there, your ancestors and we will be happy.
You see, they're in there. Oh, really? Okay, so is it feeding? It's like, this is colonial spaces. They're taking away my performance. Let's try again. My name is Duduzile Libazisa Sfisa Mathonsi, the comforter, the one that consoles the wish of the raindrops. She who is born of the womb of the Shipalana women. The outspoken women, the brave women who never give up only in sleep. Nice to meet you all. Part of my work is exploring the relationship between movement, which I am restricted to right now, and voice. Which leads me to the question, can movement and voice contribute to representation or lack thereof? How these elements relate when telling stories, voice relating to language, tonality, expression, culture. Movement relating to space, body space, claiming of space, and pleasure of movement. I work with the Black female body in space, the narration of stories, agencies, and archives. We all have archives that we bring. We all have mannerisms that we use that influence how we speak, move, and perform. Societies have spoken and unspoken rules of engagement. And, if not followed, there are consequences. For example, social exclusion. This could be argued the same way in art spaces. If I use my own cultural reference to a reaction, I use my body, my voice, and a whole lot of facial expressions. which could be read as aggressive. It's okay, I won't bite. Intimidating. Too much. Attitude. Dominating. Or simply, I just could be funny. In no way I would have to think twice and not go over the social rules of engagement and staying below the tonality line. Being a black woman is about the kaleidoscopic. Having complex patterns. Hello. See? Sabotage. Multicolored, kaleidoscopic patterns, ever-changing, impermanent, multifaceted, made up of complex mix of elements. And the chameleon, looking at the temporality of the black female body, our bodies are in constant temporary state of existence. But we can't be in a permanent state of chameleon because our DNA is resistant. So, there is a question of what do we really represent when we are asked to represent? Representation, according to Google, is the action of speaking or acting on behalf of someone or the state of being represented. The question is, represented by whom? Each body is able to represent itself, and I can only fully represent myself. And once I have shared my experience with others in acknowledging others' conviction, we can begin the process of representing each other. I am a black, heterosexual woman who was born and raised in South Africa and currently living in Norway. By order of privilege within the human chain, I am at the bottom before trans black women. When we look into artistic freedom, since I'm an artist, in an interview I was asked, what does artistic freedom mean to you? This is in relation to the ongoing conversation of artistic freedom. In my attempt to write, I got a bit stuck on the question, which paused my reply. I could not really tackle the question as I wasn't sure if it aligned with how someone who looks like me could navigate the world. As I began writing what artistic freedom meant to me, the only thing that I could think of was, whose answer do I give? The chameleon? Or Duduzile libazisas fiso Mathonsi? The chameleon's answer would be that artistic freedom should be anyone's right, and art can help change societies for the better. And artistic freedom is crucial in injecting different ways of critical thinking. It is supposed to work outside of the systematic infringement of being, therefore allowing free creation. Artistic freedom allows stories to be told without censorship of truths. It allows freedom of imagination and is a medium that can allow important conversations to exist. If we cannot express, then we cannot exist. It is parallel with human rights. My answer, Duduzile libazisas fiso Mathonsi, human rights. What is that? You would have to be considered human. That said, artistic freedom is relative, and we cannot ignore who it's offered to and how it's offered to those it's offered. As we all stand against the freedom of being artists, as we all join together as race and gender alike, history has taught us that people of color will go to war with whiteness, but when the victory is reeled in, there's a tendency to leave us behind. I have more than one protest. That is artistic freedom in general. Systematic racism within the arts and human rights before artistic freedom. Maybe as we look into free art, let's also look into the systems that do not offer free art to all. Artistic freedom, to me, is freedom of being. What I want to do in my artistry, and where my creation or creative process wants me to be, choosing art as a medium for my creative process, not what I should represent or who. Artistic freedom is the freedom to be Black and have a singular identity amongst many other artists, whatever color they are. Not decolonizing. Yeah, you heard me. Because it's not my job to decolonize. It is the job of the colonizer. Not making every artistic decision on whether or not I am the spectacle or the spectator. But I want to make a theater about a rock. Yes, I too want to massage a rock and get unlimited funding for it. Many people do not understand contemporary or experimental art to begin with. For example, you must be educated in the vocabulary of the art or simply enjoy being perplexed half the time. I mean, this is my opinion. And so I ask these questions. Who is this kind of art for? Who are we making art for? Why are we telling the stories we tell? What could art be? Over the years, the contemporary art has become about being able to play, which of course, a luxury afforded to the few and in between. But what if radical performance was normal? What if the unique pieces were not unique? What if the norm was to make unique work? And also end the culture of damn appropriation and looting, which meant investigating your work further and evaluating it. The world needs that from us. It doesn't have to be big. It can be small, yet powerful. The world is changing, but is art? What could you be for people who are not visible? How can you relate? How can you create spaces that are not about the bourgeois and the rich? How can this kind of art be about the people? Establishments have a responsibility to make sure that there's a space for different stories to be told and different agencies to exist in these spaces. Whose story are we telling? Why do we still make art for the few? Is it because we can, financially? The creation of those closed-off networks, that in itself is elitism. Lack of representation is institutionalized racism. And only you can make a difference. The pressing, existing conversation is racism. More so, institutionalized racism, as it is the backbone of Western colonization. Looking at the harm that it has come from living in a racist society, especially for Black people. How it has created a distortion of whiteness's perspective of itself and its surroundings. There cannot be a debate on whether or not racism can exist. I repeat to the people in the back, there cannot be a debate of whether or not racism exists. Those who are experiencing it are telling you it does. All you have to do, hear them. After all, it's human courtesy. This is urgent. Our lives are at stake. and we're goddamn not breathing. The importance of black art. First of all, Black lives! Black lives matter. Black art matters. African art has existed long before modern art, with its phenomenal expressions of power, imagination, emotion, and spiritual experience. It has shaped our culture and how we move in the world and tell our stories as Black people. There needs to be different injections of archives and stories, including new and more ethnic voices. Western art has not accommodated other ways of storytelling. Sorry, Thomas, I mean European art. Instead, has created neoliberalism echo chambers, a culture of appropriation and looting of other modes of arts. Blackness needs to be able to tell its own stories, and not only to be allowed to make art about its pain, because it's far more dynamic and magical than its pain. Validation in art matters. Art is inspired by reality. Art is not art for art's sake. Art is a process, a vulnerable process that can help us evolve. Art is political. Art has a power that can change the world. Art can also be a threat to power. Art is supposed to be a space that accommodates all voices and not just the privileged few. Art is supposed to be a space where activism exists when all other spaces are closed. Art is supposed to be an advocate for freedom. Art is also supposed to be the platform for freedom of speech. But when does freedom of speech infringe on basic human rights? Times have changed, and we have to evolve, and new ways of creating has to be made. Art that can instigate change, art that can inspire the muted, unheard voices, art that is not determined by the Malungo gaze, the white gaze. Art that is not filtered by Western conviction, because my conviction too matters. Art that is dynamic, rich, and diverse. Because the art that exists does not echo the diversity of humankind. I don't have the answers, but I can ask you the questions. When you look at me, do I represent you? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Duduzile. Thomas and Bodhisattva, do you have any response to this as a performance within Afrofuturism, just to narrow it a little bit now?
Well, in many ways, to narrow it down, like I mentioned, in order to claim the future, you also have to claim the contemporary, and usually the past as well. To use references that everyone might know, let's use the Black Panther movie. The Black Panther movie didn't start now and then said in 200 years it's like this. It started by saying 200 years ago, our ancestors discovered this mineral. And because our ancestors discovered this mineral 200 years ago, we are now flying because we were able to protect it. So what she does very eloquently in the performance is very firmly claim the contemporary and the now for her personhood, for her body, for her perspective, which radically actually changes where she can go in the future, based on whether that's defined by the other gaze, which limits the African and places the African permanently in the primitive.
Okay. So Black Panther has been mentioned twice now. That's a cartoon from the 60s, and it had success being being a film in 2018, where the country Wakanda, they have this mineral called vibranium that makes them technological, far in front of other countries, but they are concealing it, not to be exploited. And in the end of the I have only seen the film. It seems to me that this film and other stories I read, and also your performance, it's like the goal is to do something good and to reach equality. In the end, this superhero makes a social outreach center in the States, because in the States there are so much poverty also for Black people. So
yeah, well, in some ways it deals with a dialogue that is actually happening very often between Africa and the diaspora, which is the combination of we were taken, we lost all of this.
Sorry, diaspora being the population
Africa
outside
Africa.
Africa.
Of the continent. Yeah. So, and then the discourse is, but why did not the kings and queens and the armies of Africa protect us? So in that movie, there's actually a very complex inter-African discourse which is happening, which is what is also happening where Wakanda, because of its technological advance, could have stopped slavery. So they are addressing the generational guilt of why did you keep your resources to yourself, and why did you allow all these others to be taken?
Yeah.
And where he is trying to somehow make a form of not retribution, but amends for that failure to the rest of the African children, in a sense.
Yeah,
is part of that.
And he goes to the UN and say, okay,
Yeah.
we can help the world.
And what is interesting in that, where I would say where it's specifically Afro or African futurism, is that vibranium is not what makes Wakanda the most powerful, because the Black Panther does not get his main power from vibranium. He gets his main power from Bast, which is a female African deity and spirit, and from the realm of the ancestors. And notice even how Okoye and the females in the movie are more than matching him and kicking more butt than he is, actually without having to drink this essence.
Yeah, Okoye is the general, female
it's
general.
the female general. Without having to drink from this very female flower shaped like a feminine body part, and without having been buried in the earth, which is also Mother Earth, or water, which so every time he is empowered through the feminine ancestral line. Therefore, the women of Wakanda don't even need that to match him. And that's where it's both feminist, in a sense, or reclaiming African feminine perspective and power, and it's Afrofuturistic. So it's not actually focusing on the technology, it is focusing on the spiritual and rhythm technology, because even vibranium is a technology of rhythm.
Okay, yeah.
I think this is when we look at now coined term Black feminism, right? Because feminism is also a white terminology.
Can we have some light on Duduzile?
I know, they're trying to
Possible?
sabotage me today. I don't know. All this gorgeousness and you just don't want it here. Like, what's happening? And it is a colorism thing, right? No, it's okay.
Yes.
There we go.
And I interrupted you also, so
no,
I'm
it's
sorry.
fine.
Yeah.
When we do look at Africanism, our ancestors are women. Like when we go, our elders are women, the wisers are women. When we look at ancient African history, our gods were women. So feminism is something that is new, or it's a rebirth of something that already exists in its own way. And of course, I guess white feminism is also looking at certain ways of attacking not attacking, but challenging. Well, let's say attacking patriarchy. But I think it was good that the term Black feminism was created, because then it actually created a space for Black women to be able to relate with our issues, but also somehow can still have the archives of who we are and what we believe in. So again, we're going back to the past in order to create a future. But I just wanted to touch on this difference between Afrofuturism and African futurism. And for me, I think over the last couple of weeks since we spoke, it's like I've been thinking to myself, how do I come in and talk about Afrofuturism? It's also very foreign to me, because Afrofuturism is coined in the Americas. And as an African, born and raised, now living in the diaspora, how do I now enter the conversation? And Afrofuturism is also created because of a violent migration. My migration was volunteered, right? So how do I now create a future for Africans in the diaspora when it's a volunteered migration? So I think for me, how I started to think about it is like separating Afrofuturism and African futurism. They work parallel to each other, but they're not the same thing. And I think sometimes, or a lot of the times, as you said, it's a marketing ploy, right? What happens is that we fall all under Afrofuturism, and then again, we are all Black, rather than understanding that we have different agencies, different archives, and we come together as a mass to fight a common problem, but we're different in so many ways, and our histories and our beliefs. And in creating this future, we need to acknowledge the indifferences between us, and look at our different archives to strive for a future that we can work together side by side and not necessarily be mushed as one.
Yeah, okay. So just to have it mentioned while I remember it, Afrofuturism was made in 1992 or 94 by Mark Derry, a journalist. He asked, why aren't there more Black authors writing science fiction, since the nightmare in science fiction has been alive for many Black people in the diaspora outside Africa, being kidnapped by an alien and put into slavery in a strange country. So there has been Afrofuturistic and other futuristic work long before that. And it was interesting talking to you the other day, Bodhisattva, when you said that after the financial crisis in the beginning of 2008, and after the Arab Spring, and after big political crises, the futuristic art and literature exploded.
Yeah.
Is that connected somehow to the goal of the world being a better place, equality, that everyone can claim their spaces and so on?
Absolutely. So first I wanted to thank you for your performance lecture. It was wonderful. And I also wanted to connect two things to it. And one is the question of marketing, but it's also a question of who gets to sell what. Who gets to claim a space, right? Who gets to claim art? Who gets to claim the future? And all of these are also questions that are, this is exactly why a lot of people who work within, for instance, Afrofuturism or African futurism or, indigenous futurisms are really averse to the term science fiction. They really don't.
They
don't
like the term
they don't
science
like
fiction.
science
No.
fiction.
Okay.
They don't like the term science fiction because science fiction is actually a history of that violence as well. When you mention this whole idea of aliens being plucked, and put in another space, like we are not aliens. It's not that. This was not an alien encounter. It's something else. It's not some thing out there that captured us. It's a real living history, right? And its real living histories are embedded also in the processes of art making, in the process of the market, and all of that. So the financial crash and and one of the reasons why I think a lot of this took off, at that point of time with the Arab Spring and so on, the reason for it is precisely this idea of reclamation of a future, really, because again, it's a financial crash. Financial crash for who? Right? Who the people who don't have money, where's the financial crash? Right? We don't have anything. What are you going to take? Right? So the sudden this notion of crisis, which is used again and again, it's a terrible notion, right? So a lot of these futurisms are very averse to this whole idea of science fiction. They don't want to be put in that pot. So they want to create new structures, new ways of thinking, new terms, new ways of identifying one's own craft and art, and also to reclaim the future from these kinds of horrible notions of crisis. Right? It's a hopeful moment. There is hope in that revolution. It's revolutionary. It's a political act. So yeah, absolutely. It's a hopeful move.
Can I just add to this as well? I think also calling out white artists in using sci-fi, which has Afrofuturism in their works, and then saying, no, but it's science fiction, right? So it's also a way for them to come in and loot that and appropriate that and use that, all because one human was blue. But the histories are the same, right? And the storyline is the same. And some sci-fi have monsters with hair that look like mine. But of course we're gonna say, no, but it was this... But we're gonna say that no, it's science fiction. It's not real, right? So we're not really appropriating. So it's creating loopholes for injection of taking and also dehumanizing us all over again.
Yeah. And after you, I would like to say something.
Yes. I'm not sure if it's big enough so that you can see it, but this is not an alien or a mutant. This is an African. And similarly, this as well. But if you've watched Star Trek, yes. We discussed it earlier.
It looks like, okay.
It's
Star Trek.
Klingon and so on. So, and if you look at, there's another one here, if you can see it. If you've seen Mystique in X-Men, this is what they body painted Mystique as. So in all of this, in X-Men and in Star Trek and so on, the alien is simply African. And even if you look at when did the demons get horns, etc., and when did Europe have its trip to Africa, let's call it that in lack of other words, you see very clearly that the demon is an African. The alien is an African. And what happens to you when your reality becomes other people's sci-fi, etc.? And that is also part of why we're so adverse to the term sci-fi and so on, because that also is a colonial product, which removes our reality and even our bodies from us, because our bodies are now alien. And if you are alien, just like you learn in biology, when alien elements enter your body, the white blood cells attack. And therefore, xenophobia is a natural explanation for why we attack. It all fits into this cycle of violence.
There are some successful Afro-American authors who also call themselves science fiction authors, like N.K. Jemisin. I have 2 books here. She's maybe in the 50s now or something. I read her, it's been Black History Month in Norway this October, Black History Month Norway. But she has a collection of short stories called How Long to Black Future Month, with really good stories. In the preface there, she writes about how when she was in the beginning of her career in the, 2000 something, she wanted to write, but she couldn't imagine to write about black main characters, although she's a black herself because she wanted to sell. And if you want to sell, you have to have white characters. So she, in the beginning, she did that. And then she turned to black main characters, and she's a best-selling author. Bodhisattva, what happened then? Before her, it was Octavia Butler, Samuel Delaney. There were like a couple of more, maybe. There were not many. And then so many Afro-American and maybe other Afrofuturist authors had success. What happened?
There were actually many, but it's also a question of what gets written and what gets recognized as well. And Sherry Renee Thomas's Dark Matter anthologies, they are from the early 2000s. The Black speculative arts movement is from the early 2000s, early mid 2000s. So there is a lot that is happening. A lot of writers are writing. People like Okorafor, who are also actually writing, who's writing Shuri at the moment.
Yes,
or Jemison is writing actually Far Sector. She's writing about a black Green Lantern. It's fantastic, worth reading. So there have been writers. I think with I want to kind of like, so Jemison is a phenomenon, right? And I want to add to this, not only that she's a best-selling author, but the Hugo Awards, the top prize, really in science fiction. So she has won it for all 3 novels in that series. She's the only human to do so, and she's also the only woman to do so, and also the only black author to do so. So whatever you want to add on to that, I'll just say she's.
So she's an exception, is that what you're saying?
No, I'm not saying that she's an exception. I'm saying her series and what she writes and the moment at which it arrives is kind of an exception, right? Because this is, and again, to go back to the financial crisis and what happens after that in terms of like the marketing strategies and so on and so forth, there is a recognition because so 2009 is a very central moment in a lot of science fiction circles because that is the moment of the race fail debates that happened in Wisconsin, and a lot of those debates centered around the lack of diversity and diverse voices and diverse faces in science fiction. And there was a huge backlash, primarily from very conservative white writers, who basically went on an argument and tirade against it, and a crusade, if one wants to use that word.
They didn't want black characters in science fiction?
They did not want diversity, period. No women, for that matter. They were also against women, by and large. So, but the field had changed, There's like, it's no longer really like for the last, at least, decade, we can see that the field has changed. And
but why? Why do we have an event here at Diechmans Tøyen about Afrofuturism?
To a certain extent, it's because the field has gathered enough energy. There is a market, and that's an important point. There is a market, right? People want to read these stories. People want to hear other things. But I think another very important thing has happened. I think the world is, where I kind of began with, the notion of closed futures. So if we look at, for instance, a phenomenon like climate change, right, or climate fiction, there's a lot of Anglophone, there's a lot of white SF being written, which is all really disasters, right? The world, we know that there is a lot of disaster happening, but where are the actual stories where, disaster is just Tuesday? And people have really, they have struggled, they have fought. And Nick Estes, the indigenous author, he says, our history is the future. He talks about the Dakota Access Pipeline. So these futures are also, in a way, much more positive. In a strange, odd way, they're much more positive.
Yeah.
And I think people are turning to that. The world has changed, thankfully.
Word. Thomas?
Well, I think also we have to examine what we're saying and how we're saying it in some ways. Because if I would engage with Siddiqui, who is a keeper of tradition through the drums and so on, and even if you look at hieroglyphs, in even hieroglyphs, they are flying vehicles there. So how long has Africa engaged with going to the stars and so on. India equally, and so on. China equally, where even cultivation is about sending your soul out into the universe and actually being able to cultivate the power of the stars. So how long has these other cultures really been engaged with something similar to sci-fi? But then we also have to remember that for close to 400 years, all of the African diaspora were not allowed to read and write. And it's less than 100 years that that's really not so. My grandfather, both of my grandfathers grew up during segregation. You grew up partly during apartheid. So we also had to admit that part of why there's such an influx of this now is because it's the first generation who has access to not only reading and writing it that way, but to being printed.
Right.
And there's millions, if not hundreds of millions of Black now reading who were not a market before because they would be killed for reading.
Yeah.
And that is also a huge part of this whole why, in a sense. And then it's authenticity. The demand for authenticity has changed. You don't need to go back more than 30 years where you would see Africa at the museum or at the library because that was your access. Now you will pick up, well, not now during Corona, but pre-Corona, you would pick up and you would just go to Kenya.
And in the future.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you would just go to Kenya. And that has radically shifted kind of the demand for authenticity, where you would prefer to read this coming from someone that you perceive to be closer to the core. So just to add those things into that mix, because we can't forget it as we discuss this. Why is this suddenly it's not that we have the...
But
all the authors, before we were allowed to read and write, a lot of our authors were oral.
Yeah.
A lot of our stories were within oral storytelling because that was a survival tactic, and also because it's part of our heritage, being able to tell stories through, and sci-fi stories as well, through oral translation or through passing the book on orally, where people sit. And now I'm reading the book, which is an oral book. And now, of course, after now we're able to be admitted into the writing pool, we're able now to translate some of these stories. I mean, a lot of African futurism in terms of like their stories is part of oral traditions of storytelling that is there. And it's just like, there's the story of this and this. Then I take that and I put it into a different space. And then it becomes the sci-fi. But in actual fact, these sci-fi stories within African authors, a lot of them have existed long before sci-fi was even a thing.
Yeah.
It's just a new medium of publicizing them in a way.
So
I want to quickly add to that because of the issue of education and also who can read what. And one of the things also about Afrofuturism, which and a lot about these futurisms, is that it's primarily in English and in French. But there's quite a bit of African futurism in French, but primarily in English. Some Portuguese, some French, but primarily in English. That also helps access, right? And for instance, when I look at materials from India, right, and there's a lot, but the things that people can actually read and access, they're all in English. So I can't tell people to read text in Bangla or Hindi or Marathi.
So it's in the colonizer's language. That's a paradox, isn't it?
I mean, language is a powerful tool when it comes to suppression and also comes to excluding. It also plays a huge role in representation. I mean, now if we look at Norway, one of the conversations is that there is not a proper vocabulary to address race relations. In itself, that is suppression, because instead of saying, okay, how do we create a broader language that accommodates this? It's like, but in my language, there isn't this word, so I'm confused. Okay, as scholars, sit down, figure out new words, broaden the language, because it's there, and this is a topic that needs to be compensated. And now you're getting more and more immigration coming in. Norway is no longer so homogenous. It's getting new injections of cultures and whatnot. So in order to address this, the language within itself has to change, has to evolve. Each language has to evolve, but also language evolves according to the people that are there and injecting into the language. So this in itself, if we're going to take Afrofuturism or any futurism and put it into a Norwegian context, does the Norwegian language accommodate that? That's also another question if we were to take this into literature.
I reached out to a lot of people, a lot of groups before when researching this event, trying to find some authors based in Norway who connects to Afrofuturism, and I couldn't find any. Like author or text worker, you're a writer, so I found you, luckily. But there are no like books or authors. But we have, or if someone follows the stream and you connect to Afrofuturism, please send me an email. But we have actually two examples of indigenous futurism, I think. It's Taraniga Raya. Det lenge til skumring. Her parents is from Sri Lanka, but she has written this book about a Sami state in nynorsk, in New Norwegian, and Sigbjørn Skåden, who also is Sami. So, but there could be more. But I'm wondering if this is a flourishing thing. When will it happen in Norway, or will it? Your friend in Sweden, he could mention too.
Yeah. I don't know when it will happen in Norway, but I think the question is itself like, and this is also why in my project Go Futures, I don't just look at text, I also look at films, I also look at video games and arts and so on, right? So it's a whole package. So I think just putting it in the framework of, who are the people writing texts, as you just said, like it's oral cultures. There's a lot of performance, there's a lot of different ways of understanding futures, which are not bound to the text.
But we're a library.
Yeah.
We're a modern library. We want everything.
Well, we have audiobooks. Okay.
That's true. Yeah. Please. We had oral books also, actually.
Well,
here.
again, it's linked to a little bit of perspective, because several of the people who are now put under Afrofuturism, for example, didn't place themselves there initially. They've been placed there after the fact. That's number one. Number two, if one is listening to rap lyrics, one is listening to the slam poetry, one is looking at the dance that is happening and so on, African futurism, Afrofuturism, Caribbean futurism and so on is alive and thriving in Norway.
Yeah, and we also
but there is, and I also have to mention that, there is a really big divide, especially in literature, as to who gets published. Melaninrik, I would say, is a very good example of that, because we started using that actively in 2004.
Instead of black.
And it's, instead of minority. So it was never meant to replace black, it was meant to replace minority, and do the same for the language as hen does to gender, Melaninrik can do to other things. So actively since 2004, and you will find blogs, you will find a lot, but because it's not officially published under something, Språkrådet and other will say, oh, in 2020, this was the new word, and we are now starting to taste this word. It's late, but because black people have not had access to that core space, in a sense, so Columbus syndrome says that Melaninrik was the word of 2020. The black population in Norway said it in 2004.
Okay.
So it's, as I will say, it's while we are waiting for us to be published, we can say it's not present, but it's very present.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then the push should really be, let's get some of those people published.
Yeah.
Officially.
And I mean it. Please come to Diechmans Tøyen. We want to hear you.
But I also we have to also look at, we can ask to get those people published, but this is why in my work I target institutionalized racism. Because we can sit here and we can talk about being blue, about needing there to be representation, but if the institutions themselves who have the funding, who have the capacity, who can publish, are not willing to open up their gates to let us in and change the language. And I'm not saying, God forbid, we change Norwegian. I'm saying let's let's increase the vocabulary. Let's inject new stories. But again, we have to say, how do we do it from inside?
Yeah.
How do we make sure that people who look like me or like Thomas or like you are sitting in the right places? You know, what does that mean? And when we sit there, are we sitting there in our entire conviction, or are we sitting there as a diversity card? Because there's that other conversation of like, I will hire you because you're my minority plus one, rather than do you have a voice within these spaces? Because if you have a voice, then we're one step closer to a future that includes everyone.
Okay, so there's a debate going on among Norwegian publishers now. It also was a debate in Diechmans Bjørvika a few days ago, so let's hope for a change. Time is heading into the future. I just want to mention that you are, according to yourself, the first to get a lot of money for researching science fiction from the EU. So 1.5 million euro. So something is happening. Yeah. So there's two really exciting projects going on at the University in Oslo. So it's called Co-Futures and Science Fictionality. And we will have some more practice here. Drums and the drum and the dancer is behind the curtain. That's good. Thomas, please, can I just ask you? You are running the Tabanka Dance Ensemble, and you are doing Afrofuturistic and Caribbean futuristic and other futuristic dance. Can you just explain to us what that means, and maybe a little bit about the Talawa technique, which you also have taken as your middle name, Thomas Talawa Prestø.
Yes.
What does it mean to be an Afrofuturistic dance ensemble?
Well, it can mean many things. For example, Luciano, that is dancing now, is trained in these perspectives, and it allows us, for example, to ask the question, so what if all the people who are now in the Caribbean with all their coordinates, which is multiple African nations, not Nigeria and Ghana, but African nations like Yoruba, Ewe, etc., and Indian perspectives, Chinese perspectives, European, what if they all came into that same space without colonialism and slavery? How would you move today, and how would you move 20 years from now? That is also futurism. To remove the colonial violence, for example, which is part of what we will see today, is an investigation into that. How would some of those coordinates actually move and shape if they were not brought together through that violence? So that, for example, is one way that can work. So we got a critique once where they said that she felt that Black Panther, again, this movie, was more innovative than our dance.
Okay.
And felt that we needed to mix some ballet into it. Then not to evolve the vocabulary, not understanding that mixing ballet with African is a 200-year-old project that has been done to the point of boredom. So it's the least innovating thing you could actually do. And ballet, like you said, is already actually an African fusion. The Nutcracker is very much so, especially Balanchine's version, because he took African American dance and mixed it into ballet. So the ballet aesthetics that you see today has Africa and India and China in it already, which is often forgotten. So that's as simple as I can say.
Yeah.
Some of the processes. So it's in the process.
So you have like researched many hundreds, or was it 186 or something movements, or then you have
300 separate specific dances.
Yeah. And then you have picked from those.
Movements were codified.
Yeah.
And the communalities were found and fed through a computer, actually,
Okay.
in a notation system. And based on this, we chose 81 African continental and 56 African diaspora dances, and created a system that would be able to completely recreate these dances by only training this core.
That's quite an excellent combination of tradition and sci-fi. If you took a traditional or traditional movements, put it into the computer, and now you're dancing it.
Yes, but there's also what is interesting, because if you look up Philip Emeagwali, which is a Nigerian, he was the one who made the supercomputer. And a lot of the programming, which our mobile phones and our computers are based on now, and he was a Nigerian, Yoruba, his grandfather was a bee herder, and it's a concept in the African oral proverbs about the bee that was the inspiration for why we went from having one super processor to multiple small processors working on the same task at the same time. So the computer, the PC, and the laptop is an African futurism, and it's based on African oral tradition in part. So for us, it will just be mixing ancient knowledge with ancient knowledge.
Okay.
Because the pyramids were not created by flipping a stick over on the sand, like some documentaries say. Mathematics is also very much an African thing, for example.
And they had pyramids also in Nubia, and these rich civilizations we don't hear about in school in Norway.
These are the great
Great African civilizations. Look it up. Yeah.
Kemet, Nubia, Kush.
Yes.
And this is
750 before Christ.
Nubia is where Egypt got all its gold.
Yeah.
And that's why Egypt had to invade Nubia in order to stop paying tax for the gold.
Yeah, so Wakanda is somehow also real. Well,
Getting cold.
yeah, the dancer is getting cold, so am I actually. So let's just conclude that there's a lot to dig into here, a lot to learn. Thank you to Duduzile Mathonsi, which I'm pronouncing wrong, sorry, and Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, which I'm pronouncing perfect. And thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Maya and Muntre Film, and thank you for coming also in these strange times to be here with your bodies. Good luck in the future and the present and the past. Thank you.